Hello, I'm Peter Okwacha. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Our top stories. Campaigning begins for Algeria's presidential election as demonstrations continue against what protesters call the ruling elite. International corporations are as much to blame for South Africa's corruption scandal as state officials. So says a former anti-apartheid activist, Peter Hain.
So far, the focus has been on the South African side of the state capture, quite rightly. My evidence is about international complicity.
Also on the program, France returns a 19th century sabre to Senegal. France says it is the first step to restoring Africa's ancient artifacts. Thousands of pieces still remain in French museums. The lion reportedly used to guard a house in Lagos. Now authorities are demanding answers from its owner. And in sports, 6 more 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers taking place today as Egypt are held by Comoros. Thanks for joining us here on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Campaigning for presidential elections in Algeria have officially kicked off with 5 candidates vying for the top job. They include 2 former prime ministers to President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Over the weekend, thousands of opposition protesters gathered in Algiers in disagreement with the candidates in next month's general elections. They dismissed the contest, arguing that those running are part of the same ruling elite headed by former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced to resign in April, aged 82, amid massive street protests.
People are against elections held in this way. We have been protesting for 9 months to say no to the gangs. No elections with the gangs.
We're here to say no, that elections won't happen. Elections won't happen until people decide they will. The people are the ones to decide when and how to organise an election.
Official campaigning began last night, but many of the candidates have chosen to start their campaigns in cities away from demonstrations. 4 out of the 5 candidates held government positions under the old regime. The 2 frontrunners are Ali Ben Fis and Abdelmajid Tebboune, who are both former prime ministers and are over the age of 70. The only candidate who has never held a government post is Abdelaziz Balaid, head of the Future Front Party. However, his party supported the old regime. Despite the protest, the de facto army chief has insisted the elections will go ahead on December 12th. Well, with me in the studio now is Rashid Sakai from BBC Arabic. So it's obvious that many people don't like these candidates, Rashid, but how were they chosen in the first place?
Well, Peter, the door was open for everybody who had the criteria to submit a file to the Independent Electoral Commission. Everybody could have applied. And in total, we believe that there were 22 files or candidates who submitted their files, but the Independent Electoral Commission only chose 5 out of the 22. The 5 are the ones that we heard of in the report.
Then it begs the question, isn't it? I mean, doesn't it, rather, that if people don't like them, will people come out to vote on December the 12th?
Well, it's very, very difficult to say, but from what the local analysts are saying, and the press is saying locally, is that it's very difficult to say, because though we do see this protest taking place, they are bi-weekly protests each Friday and Tuesday, calling for the end, a radical change to the system or regime. But we also have seen in the recent weeks that there are pro-election, pro-regime marches in some cities of the country. Well, it's true that the scale is much smaller than the anti-regime marches, but they still exist, which means that some people at least will go to the vote.
And we know that we have two former prime ministers to Abdelaziz Bouteflika, but is there at this point any clear favourite in the five candidates that are vying for this job?
Well, if I may just correct something incorrect, I mean, all the five have either served under Bouteflika or supported Bouteflika's regime, all of them. But there are those who basically, like Ben Fleece, who became a vocal opponent to Bouteflika and his entourage since 2004, even though he served as a justice minister and a prime minister. And you have Tebboune, Abdelmajid Tebboune as well, who was, a partisan of the ruling party that Bouteflika belonged to, but just on his last post as a prime minister, he was basically sacked, literally sacked, for expressing his views on what we call the dirty money that shouldn't be used.
All still part of the old regime, no clear favourite. Listen, yes. Rashid, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us here. Rashid Sakai from BBC Arabic. Thank you. Now, foreign companies are as much to blame for the corruption in South Africa as some top government officials. That's according to Peter Hain, a British politician and a former anti-apartheid activist. Mr. Hain was giving evidence at an ongoing inquiry into a multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal in South Africa. Leading global brands have been linked to the scandal. Milton Nkosi reports.
Anti-apartheid activist Lord Peter Hain being sworn in at South Africa's State Capture Commission of Inquiry, which is investigating corruption. Over the past couple of months, South Africa has been investigating this state-level scandal. But Lord Hain believes international companies also have a hand in the corruption. Lord Hain has been on the stand all day today with his 10,000 words written submission. I asked him why he felt compelled to come and give evidence here.
So far, the focus has been on the domestic, the South African side of the state capture, quite rightly. My evidence is about international complicity. The banks, the global banks, the international corporates, without their complicity, without their involvement in state capture and corruption, this looting of the South African taxpayers could not have occurred. You needed two to tango.
What's so important about the international leg of this corruption scandal here in South Africa?
They have provided these pipelines, these digital pipelines for that money to move, that robbed money to move, and yet they say nothing to do with us.
But with all your efforts, the money is never going to come back. Do you believe that the money will come back?
I think the South African government could institute a proper asset recovery process like other governments have done. The Nigerian government is in the process at the moment of using private agencies to recover $1.2 billion of stolen oil money. And if that can be done by Nigeria, why can't it be done by South Africa? Not using state agencies, which are not equipped for the job, but private agencies.
And how hopeful are you that in the end, the South Africa you fought for, the democracy that we are all living in, is going to be corruption-free?
It is critical for those like myself and my parents who were involved in the anti-apartheid freedom struggle, that the values of that struggle, expressed by Nelson Mandela, of integrity, of social justice and equality and human rights, that those values are the ones that are upheld.
But how confident are you that besides just getting the money back, that we'll see some of the big fish behind bars?
I don't know whether we'll see the big fish who have been looting the country behind bars or not. That's up to the South African regulatory authorities. South Africa can't do it on its own. That's why my plea has been to the governments and banks and corporates of the world, it's your responsibility. You profited by this corruption and money laundering. You must now play your part in stopping it and reversing it and getting the money back.
Lord Peter Hain there speaking to the BBC's Milton Nkosi. Let's take a quick look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. The head of the Oxford Union Debating Society is facing calls to resign after a partially sighted student from Ghana was forcibly removed from one of its events. 25-year-old Ebenezer Azamati says he arrived early and reserved his seat only to be stopped later by security staff and dragged from the chamber by his ankles. The Oxford Union president has apologized. South African Airways has restarted some of its international flights, but domestic flights remain grounded. This follows a bitter wage dispute between the struggling airline and thousands of its employees who've been on strike since Friday. Last week, SAA said it would need a restructure and that hundreds of jobs could be at risk. Now, a saber belonging to a 19th century Islamic scholar and ruler has been returned to Senegal by France. The blade originally belonged to the West African military and spiritual leader Omar Saidou. In the 1850s, his empire encompassed much of what is now Guinea and Mali, as well as Senegal. The BBC's Lamine Konkobo reports.
France's Prime Minister Edouard Philippe has met with President Macky Sall of Senegal to restore an ancient 19th century sword. The return is part of a commitment from France to give back to its former West African colonies significant items of their cultural heritage. At a ceremony in Dakar, Prime Minister Philippe handed over the curved iron, brass and wood sabre in its leather sheath to President Sall. The artifact originally belonged to the revered West African leader Omar Saidou Tall, who led an anti-colonial struggle against the French. Some of his descendants were present at the ceremony. Mr. Phillips said it was the first step in restoring artifacts in French museums to their native countries.
C'est le sabre d'un érudit.
It is the sword of a scholar who has traveled extensively to deepen their knowledge, especially in theology. For more than a year, the public can admire it at the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar. And Mr. President, it is a sword lover who tells you this. Its place is beautiful and well here in the heart of the ancient Tukulur Empire, close to the peoples who made it.
Last year, a group of experts commissioned by President Emmanuel Macron recommended that African treasures looted during French colonial occupation must be returned to their countries of origin. It is estimated that Paris's Quai Branly Museum, which specializes in African art, has approximately 5,000 Senegalese pieces that need to be returned, but it holds more than 40,000 other pieces from across the continent.
Well, joining us now from Toronto is Alexander Herman. He's the Assistant Director of the Institute of Art and Law. Thanks for talking to us. It's 1 year since President Macron made the announcement that these artifacts would be returned to African countries of origin. How many have indeed been returned?
Well, so far, really what we've seen is just the saber. And even that is somewhat problematic because it hasn't been permanently returned. The reason for that is that French law strictly controls what can leave a French public collection. So you would actually need to change the law in France to provide for a permanent return of any object to its country of origin, including the saber. So because we haven't seen those changes to the law yet, nothing has actually been permanently returned to an African state.
Well, surely President Macron must have been aware of this law when he made the promise. Or was he just making promises he couldn't keep?
Well, actually, if you look at the original declaration of President Macron, he did talk about permanent restitution, but he also talked about temporary restitution. And what he had in mind there were things like traveling exhibitions, long-term loans, museum cooperation, and the like. So it is possible to read what Macron's intentions were along the lines of more temporary restitutions rather than full-scale restitution, which requires those legal changes which I mentioned.
And what about amongst the museums and houses that keep these artifacts? Is there any sign that there's a desire by them or that there's a willingness by them to return some of these artifacts back to their countries of origin?
Well, I think both sides can be seen within the museum sector, definitely. And I would say that's true in France, just as it's true in the UK. You do have people who work quite closely with communities of origin, and they might be quite open to the idea of returning these things. But museum professionals, first and foremost, care about caring for objects and making sure that objects are looked after properly and properly conserved. So that is usually their first and foremost aspiration. And so they're happy to see those things return, provided that care is provided for in the country of origin.
And indeed, that's an argument that we've heard before on this program. People saying, well, can African countries actually take good care of these artifacts if they are indeed returned? But the counter argument to that would be that if Africans made these objects of art, then surely they'll be able to look after them well.
Yeah, and I think that's a very convincing argument. And if you look at the, by all accounts, remarkable museum in Senegal that opened last year, that the saber will now be displayed in, it's a brilliant example of how an African state can build a world-class museum that could certainly look after objects of this nature.
Okay, Alexander Herman, Assistant Director at the Institute of Art and Law, speaking to us live there from Toronto. Thank you very much for your time. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Peter Okwoche. Still to come, Mimi with the sports. South Africa's Raven Klaasen loses in the doubles final of the men's ATP Tennis World Finals here in London. I'm Peter Okwoche. The top stories this hour. Campaigning has begun for Algeria's presidential election as demonstrations continue against what protesters call the ruling elite. And international corporations are as much to blame for South Africa's corruption scandal as state officials. That's according to the former anti-apartheid activist, Peter Hay. You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. It's now time for some sports. And Mimi, the road to Cameroon 2021 continues.
It has begun already, indeed. There were several matches this weekend for the 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers, 11 in total. And today there are 6 more games. There were 2 early kickoffs. Egypt were held to their second consecutive game as hosts. Comoros battled to a goalless stalemate. Egypt were once again without their star player, Mohamed Salah, who is injured. Elsewhere, Ghana were made to work hard as Crystal Palace's Jordan Ayew scored a second-half penalty, which saw them edge Sao Tome and Principe 1-0. And in just over an hour's time at 1900 GMT, Botswana take on the reigning champions Algeria, who won the tournament this summer. Now, there are 3 matches underway. Cape Verde, 2 goals. Mozambique, 1. Gambia as well, 1 goal. DR Congo, 2. And Kenya have drawn 1-1 against Togo. So those matches are still going on, as I said. So we'll bring the latest for you as we get them. Make sure that you go to the BBC African Football website. Now, more football today. Maybe a rest day, but the Under-23 Africa Cup of Nations tournament resumes on Tuesday. The 4 teams playing will be battling to secure a place at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics next year. Remember, only 3 teams can qualify for that. Some big teams were sent packing over the weekend. BBC's Mohamed Kudba in Cairo previews the early kickoffs on Tuesday.
A win in the semi-final of the Under-23 Africa Cup of Nations will not only give the winners the chance to be in the final, it will also mean they will be there in the football tournament in Tokyo Olympics 2020. And while big names in African football like Nigeria and Cameroon were knocked out of the first round, the first semi-final will see Ghana looking for the first Olympic qualification in 16 years as they take on the Ivory Coast, who only featured once in Olympic football in 2008. Game now to be held in Cairo International Stadium after being moved from Al Salam Stadium in East Cairo to be in the same venue where the second semi-final will take place, which is going to be between hosts Egypt and South Africa.
All right, let's get away from football and to tennis, where South Africa's Raven Klaasen and his New Zealand partner Michael Venus lost a doubles final at the men's ATP Tennis World Finals in London on Sunday. They were beaten in straight sets 6-3, 6-4 by the French pairing of Herbe and Mahout.
First of all, congrats to Raven and Michael for their nice week and your 2 or 3 years together. Well done for that.
Peter, that's all your sport.
Many thanks, Mimi. Thank you. Now, just how do you celebrate your culture and heritage when you live in a faraway country? Well, for members of Nigeria's Igbo community who live in Liverpool here in the UK, they like to meet up regularly for good food, song and a dance.
When Igbos get together, it's like home from home. We eat Igbo foods, we dance Igbo music, we dress in Igbo attire, and we really feel we are back home.
Coming to the kitchen, I'll show you one of the starters we usually serve to our guests when they do visit us at home. This is known as buns. Food is one of the things that brings us together. As we are here today, we're happy to be here. We support each other, socialize with each other, and share.
I'm excited about what is happening tonight. We're bringing all the Igbos together, men, women, children, young people. That's the key, so that we work together in the interests of the community.
As Igbos, we have our own separate culture, which is very, very unique and personal and very important to us. Even our kids that are born here, they have two cultures, the English culture and the traditional Igbo culture. So when we come together like this, it helps them to understand. It's also good for them to identify who they are and identify with their people and identify with their culture as well.
I want to thank everybody for coming here today. Igbo community started in 1935. And people passed on that culture on and on. It's come to us. We're going to pass it on to the younger generation.
My mom's been bringing me here for the past 7 years, and I've loved every single moment of it because she's tried to pass on her culture from her to me, and it's been done from her mom to her mom, so I love it.
Everybody enjoyed it. It's the sort of thing that makes the community vibrant. It's beautiful.
Great stuff. Now, what lengths would you go to guard your property? Dogs and alarms are common enough, but what about a lion? That's how one homeowner in the Victoria Island area of Lagos chose to protect their house. As Damilola Odulowu reports, the police were called to deal with the animal.
Residents of Muri-Okunla, Victoria Island in Lagos have been feeling panicky after noticing the presence of a lion in the house. The Lagos state government has since Friday swung into action after receiving petitions from residents. Operatives of the Lagos State Special Offences Unit have surrounded this residence housing a lion. The wild animal is being tranquilized right now, and the task force team will be transferring it to a zoo. The owner of this animal has only been identified as an Indian, and he may likely face prosecution for bringing a carnivore to the state. The head of the task force team, Yinka Egbeyemi, told the BBC that he had the instruction of the Commissioner for the Environment, Commissioner of Police, and the Ministry of Agriculture to tranquilize the cub and to transfer it to the zoo.
Whether the man likes it or not, we must get him. He willingly should come on his own to come and tell us what he knows about the lion, how the lion got to this end. That's it.
So if he doesn't come, what are you going to do?
Of course, we know how to treat foreign nationals. We follow the procedure, rules and regulations, the procedures in getting him arrested.
The lion was confirmed to have been moved into the building 2 months ago. The reason for this still remains unknown. Damilola Odulowu, BBC News, Lagos.
Well, I never. That's it on Focus on Africa for tonight. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Goodbye.